I want to tell you something that I didn't expect to say about this month's Craft Lab resource. I went in expecting a technical manual, a step-by-step guide to writing fantasy and science fiction from one of the most decorated authors in the genre. I'm talking about NK Jemisin, who won 3 consecutive Hugo Awards for each of the books in the Broken Earth Trilogy. That's the first one. Anyway, she's the first author to ever be able to do that. And surely, I thought, she was going to hand me a formula, a system, a checklist, something that would show me how this is done. But she didn't do that. And what she gave me instead was something I didn't know I needed, but something that I think every writer needs to hear regardless of what genre they write in. Because this masterclass isn't only about writing fantasy and science fiction. It's about how to write with integrity, how to write with impact, how to write in a way that actually matters. And I have a lot of feelings about that. So let's just get into this. But before I go any further, I wanted to say a few things. So Masterclass is a paid subscription, and I know that puts it out of reach for quite a few people. I want to be upfront about that. This year, I decided to invest in my own creative development, and part of that is subscribing to a couple of platforms like Masterclass. And that's just where I'm at. But I understand that this isn't feasible for a lot of people, yet I still want to share my thoughts on what NK Jemisin taught me and my biggest takeaways from this masterclass. And hi, by the way, if you're new here, I'm Celine, and this is the Uncharted studio, where we work together to build a creative life that we actually love. The messy, the chaotic, the honest, imperfect kind of creative life that just feels good. So if you're not familiar with NK Jemisin's work, I would highly recommend checking it out. I read the Broken Earth Trilogy back in January, and I was just floored by it. It was complex, it was interesting. It's the kind of book that when you read it, it made me ask, how did she do that? How did she build a world that feels real and lived in and politically complex, and then populate it with characters who were just, I don't know, their psychology felt uncomfortable and raw, and they were broken in the best and worst ways, and they just were so multidimensional that it was fantastic. So the 5th season is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy. And yeah, I raved on and on about it in my January recap video. So I'm going to leave that linked up there. But anyway, when I was deciding what I was going to dive into for this month's Craft Lab, NK Jemisin's masterclass seemed like a natural next step to reading this trilogy. Plus, her routine is something I could trial. She writes between 11 a.m. and 5 or 6 p.m., has a minimum word count goal, and she writes what she calls a 0th draft, which is just messy and full of brackets where she inserts things later, and she's just getting the bones down. And that feels like something that's feasible and viable and within reach, basically something that feels safe enough for me to attempt right now. So I'm going to do that in the Exploration Week video in 2 weeks. But anyway, first up is the masterclass itself, 16 lessons, and I have thoughts. The masterclass is listed as NK Jemisin teaches fantasy and science fiction writing. And yeah, there is world building in there. There are character exercises, there is craft, and there are essential aspects that will help you write sci-fi and fantasy stories. And she shares her own journey in the genre and how the genre is evolving over time. But the thing that hit me most, the thing I keep coming back to, and is underneath all of that, under every single lesson of hers, is this consistent message that your writing is an act of responsibility, not done in a heavy and preachy way, but rather in a deeply practical, deeply human way. Jemisin is essentially saying the worlds you build, the characters you create, and the people you choose to put in the spotlight, all of that is a choice. And those choices matter because readers, especially readers who've never seen themselves in a story, feel those choices and they're impacted by them. She opened her masterclass by talking about hitting 30 and realizing she wasn't happy with the trajectory her life was taking. And then she was reading different books and she thought, I can do better than this. So she decided to write. And that really resonated with me too, because I've restarted my life quite a few times so far. And when I say I restarted at 35. You can hear more about that in the video I've linked over here. But basically, I decided to leave my corporate life behind and to pursue a life full of creativity at its core. Yeah, sure, I still do work as a freelancer, but I've been building the Uncharted studio and I've been writing and prioritizing this. I also have a whole bunch of other stuff that weighs on me and that takes up time, but I chose to put creativity at the center of what I want to do and how I want to live. And that makes me feel like this person, this teacher, isn't just someone who came up through a prestigious MFA and always knew they were going to be a writer, but rather someone who changed course, who did the work, and who now has 4 Hugo Awards. And that matters. That made me feel like I was being understood by the person who was teaching me how to write science fiction and fantasy and so much more. The practical heart of her masterclass is this roadmap that I found extremely useful. She starts with world building and she dives into the macro and micro aspects of it. Macro meaning the physical world, you know, the continents, the planet, the weather systems, the laws of physics. And then she has these exercises that I loved. Let me just grab my maps. I actually got deeper into my own maps by using her exercises and explored them even more. My notebook is falling apart. This is the original map I made for my world, where I have the continents and then I had all these little brown mountains and green bits for the forests and things, and just water, islands, everything traced. But through her system, I have a digital version of this as well, but through her system, I dove into how the air and water currents work and where the equator is and how things are harder at the equator. She was talking about how generally life is harder to live in the equator and it gets easier the further away you move from this line because of how the different currents, the air and water currents, just come and meet at this line. So I found that just so fascinating, so helpful. And also I have a map of the city, the specific city in the world that I'm writing in. There we go, a little map. So I just dove deeper into these using her roadmap and her world building guidance. So yeah, these are my maps. I've been building this world for over a decade, working on it across multiple books. And what Jemisin's macro world building exercises did for me were just make me think more causally about my world. She has this 5-step process. You start with the hemispheres, the planet, you add continents, you talk about air and water currents, you pick a location, and then you decide on what she calls her element X. Element X is the one thing about your world that is different from ours. It's, you know, the Force in Star Wars or mutation when you talk about the X-Men. And for the Broken Earth trilogy, it's orogeny. So it's the ability to control seismic activity. And crucially, the social and political structures that have grown up around this ability. And for my world, we've got hemomancy, so blood magic, where certain people have this genetic mutation in their blood that when it's used and consumed gives them access to magic. And now that's a very scientific way to approach it. A lot of these cultures don't know that this is a genetic mutation. It depends on how scientifically evolved they are and where in the timeline we are, because different books I've written take place at different stages in this world's timeline. And anyway, we've got different cultures where some cultures approach this magic, this ability, as something to be revered. And this is the leadership and the gods of the world, whereas others use these people as essentially chattel and an energy force and a fuel rather than something that has freedom. They're stripped of their freedom simply because they have magic. So I feel the NK Jemisin's way of approaching how different people respond to magic and to power as so fascinating, and it helped me think about my own world in a much more spherical way. So yeah, what I love about this Element X concept is that it's not just a cool magic system. It's a social question. It's asking what happens when one group of people has something that another group doesn't. Who gets the power? Who gets exploited? And then it takes us straight into micro world building, which is where things get really interesting if you ask me, because lesson 5 is all about power dynamics. And Jemisin has this full list of questions that I absolutely loved. I have a few favorites that include who has power and who is trying to maintain the existing roles in society, or who feels threatened when someone overcomes and transgresses and steps outside these roles. And probably my favorite is who would tell the most interesting story. The last question just made me pause, because actually realizing which character has the most interesting story to tell is so variable, even within the same magic system. In the first book I told in this world, I told it the story from a dual point of view, one of privilege and one from slave. And this book, the one I'm writing now, is told from the point of view of someone who is perceived to be a prodigy, someone who has a lot of magical power and yet no real power. She has privilege, but no ability to actually change anything in reality. And she comes to terms with that fact and pushes against that throughout the story. So the most interesting character to follow isn't always the one with the most power. It's often the one navigating this friction between what they appear to be and what they actually are. And when she talks about this idea of what kind of outsider you want to be when you're drawing on a culture that isn't your own, especially when she talks about cultural appropriation and how to do this well. She references this book called Writing the Other by Nissi Scholl and Cynthia Ward, which I haven't read yet, but I've added it to my TBR. And Jemisin says that you can come into a culture as a tourist, as an invader, or as an invited guest, and each of these frame the way you talk about it and the way you think about it and write about it. Because the choices of how you approach cultures that aren't yours says something about you as a writer, and it shows up on the page. So you have to be really conscious of how you're doing this, especially if you're writing about cultures that aren't your own. Next up, she talks about characters, and this is where NK Jemisin's background in psychology becomes really visible and really valuable. She makes the point, and I think it needs to be said more, that we have this preconceived notion of what trauma looks like. We've seen it on TV, we've seen it in film. It's dramatic, it's visible, it's over the top, it's emotional, and we see somebody falling apart. But in reality, that's not necessarily how trauma manifests. And anyone who's done any research into psychology or who's experienced it will often tell you that trauma presents differently in different people. Trauma may be control, over-the-top control, or calm. This calm exterior where the inside is just bubbling over. Sometimes it manifests as humor, because when you've experienced something that shatters your sense of safety, your nervous system learns to protect you by making you hyper-controlled or hyper-vigilant, not just hyper-emotional. She says that if you write trauma the way you've seen it performed in media, you're writing a stereotype, not a person. And I have a character in my story right now who experiences panic attacks. She experiences these panic attacks in a similar way that I do. And it's something that isn't over the top. She goes through moments of panic and manic control, but then she also goes through periods where you can't see it from the outside, but it's all there. It's something I've talked through with my therapist over time, and it's something that I don't see depicted enough in books, in stories. You can always find a different way that rather than what's just typically shown. This feeds directly into her approach on archetypes. Specifically, she really wants us to interrogate the archetype of the rugged individualist. The character, usually male, usually physically powerful, who overcomes adversity through sheer strength or force. Things like old James Bonds or Mad Max or even some John Wayne characters, it's just this strong man who fixes things with his fists. And she says that this character isn't necessarily bad, but this character has been the default for so long as the hero that we've stopped questioning it. We've stopped asking whose stories we're not telling, and we've stopped noticing that we force women into this mold. We're not actually writing women, we're writing men in women's clothing. So she asks you to interrogate every archetype, to ask, what does strength actually look like for this person in this body, in this power structure? And she has this pyramid that I want to show you because it's one of those tools that I found extremely valuable. You see, she takes Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you might remember that from psychology, from high school or whatever, and she adapts it into a character development model. So at the base, you've got the demographics, age, race, gender, the things you would know from a 30-second glance at a person. Next up, you have their outer life, their class, their role in society, how they present themselves, the things you'd figure out from a short conversation with them. And at the very top, you've got their inner life, their goals, their fears, their dreams, their weaknesses, the things that only people closest to them would know. And the process is simple but powerful. You build from the bottom up. You don't start with the inner life and work backwards. Rather, you start with the world they were born into, and then let that shape everything that comes after. Because identity doesn't come from nowhere. Demographics don't dictate who someone is, but rather they massively influence it. The world your character was born into, the power that they have or don't have, and the roles they are expected to perform, all of that shapes their inner life in ways that are specific and real and not interchangeable. I want to end with the last lesson, lesson 16, because I think it's the one that ties everything together. Jemisin talks about writing while marginalized and about the reality that depending on how far you veer from what she calls the systemic norm, either as a woman, as a person of color, as a disabled writer, as a queer writer, you will face bigotry, or at least you might. You may face people who question your right to tell certain stories, and you may face the very real question of whether you should be visible or hide behind some sort of mask, whether that's a pen name or not appearing in public or whatever you choose to do. And she talks about her own lived experience of this throughout her whole masterclass, woven through every lesson and in the specific examples she chooses, in the questions she asks, and in the way she talks about who gets to be the hero. And she says something that I keep thinking about. She says that there are people out there who need your example. You're not just writing for yourself anymore, you're writing for the people who need to see themselves in a story. And that really landed for me because I come from a very specific place. I'm from Cyprus, which has the last divided capital in the world. My father is South African, and growing up, whenever people would find out that my dad's South African, they'd ask me why I'm not Black. For example, there was a lot of discrimination and bullying around that, and I never felt connected to the country that I'm from because I never felt Cypriot enough. I felt like I was straddling these two worlds and I didn't fully belong in either one. And that's a pain that I've had to carry with me, the feeling of not being enough. And that's something that I feel a lot of people can connect to. I'm also disabled. I became disabled about 8 years ago now, and my disabilities are invisible, which adds this other layer to it. I have chronic illnesses, and they're going to be influencing me for the rest of my life, and most people will never even know because they can't see it. So when Jemisin talks about writing for people who have felt marginalized or who felt invisible or who felt they were not enough, that's who I'm writing for. I want to write for people who have experienced discrimination, people who felt like they didn't belong, and people who felt that they're not social enough, not accepted, not good enough in some way. And that's a pain that I'm carrying and a pain I'm working through. And I want my writing to make people who feel that way feel seen and feel heard and understood. And what I expected from this masterclass was just a technical manual, but what I got was a mirror, a reminder of why I write in the first place. And I think that that's the most valuable thing that any craft resource can do. So what am I doing with all this? Well, firstly, it's going directly into my manuscript where I have a morally complex protagonist, and Jemisin's character pyramid is sitting on my desk right now. So I'm going back through what I know about her and I'm asking, did I build it from the ground up? Do I know her demographics as deeply as I know her inner life? And do I know what roles she performs in the power structures of her world and what happens when she transgresses them? Next, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be trialing Jemisin's routine, an 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. writing day, a minimum word count, a zeroth draft approach, messy, full of brackets, not precious. And I'm going to be documenting that whole thing and sharing how it goes. If you've read the Broken Earth trilogy, I would love to know what you thought about it. Drop it in the comments below. And if you've done Jemisin's masterclass, I really want to know what landed for you, because I feel like everyone comes out of this masterclass with something different. I'll see you next week, and until then, happy writing.